If you are here tonight, something has happened. Not necessarily recently. Grief does not observe a calendar. It arrives when it arrives, and it stays as long as it stays, and it sometimes returns after you believed it had finished, arriving again in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, or at 3 in the morning, or on a day that has no particular significance except that it is the day the grief chose to return. You are not alone in this. Before we begin, leave one word in the comments tonight. One word for what you are carrying. Hollow, heavy, missing, broken, raw, whatever is honest. Someone else will arrive here carrying the same word and feel less alone for finding it. If this channel is finding you something worth returning to, the subscribe button is there. It costs nothing. It means a night like this one will find you again. Now, close your eyes if they are ready. Tonight's stories come from 7 traditions and 10 centuries, drawn from corners of the Buddhist world rarely heard together in English. A Tibetan woman who lost her daughter in the first year of her mountain practice and discovered in the grief something the practice had not yet given her. A Japanese monk of the Kamakura period whose teacher died before he was ready, and who found in the unreadiness something more honest than any prepared departure could have been. A Chinese poet-monk of the Tang Dynasty who wrote 100 poems about loss over 40 years, and understood, in the writing of the last one, that the poems had been doing something he had not known they were doing. A Korean laywoman of the Goryeo period who nursed her husband through a long illness and sat beside him at the end, and received in that sitting a teaching no monk had ever given her. A Burmese forest monk who spent 3 years in a cemetery practicing with the fact of death, and found in those 3 years not despair but a quality of attention to living that he had not been able to find anywhere else. A Vietnamese grandmother who outlived 4 of her 7 children and was known in her village as the calmest person anyone had ever met, and who had a very specific reason for the calm that was not what people assumed it to be. And a very old Sri Lankan nun who was asked, on the last morning of her life, whether she was afraid, and whose answer has been carried through the tradition for 1500 years. These stories are contemplative in nature, offered here for rest and reflection, not as medical or therapeutic advice. Simply stories, simply this. Feel where your body meets whatever is beneath it right now. The specific warmth of it, the weight, the breath, which has continued through every difficult thing you have ever been through, which is continuing now. The stories are waiting. Let us begin. In the region of Kham in eastern Tibet, in the early years of the 12th century, there was a woman named Sultrim Palmo who had entered solitary retreat on a mountain above the valley of her childhood at the age of 33, following a period of intensive training at the Kagyu monastery in the valley below. She had entered the retreat with the specific intention that her teacher had given her, which was to stabilize what she had understood in her mind so that it could become what she knew in her body. The distinction her teacher drew was precise. Intellectual understanding of the Dharma is not the same as embodied recognition, and the gap between those two things is sometimes very large, and the crossing of it requires conditions that communal life rarely provides. She had been on the mountain for 2 years when her daughter died. The daughter was 17. She had been healthy. The death was the kind that comes without warning to the young in any century, and comes without any concession to the timing of those who love them. A fever that moved too quickly for anyone to reach in time to do anything useful. A monk from the valley monastery climbed to Tsultrim Palmo's hermitage to tell her. She sat with the news for the rest of the day. She had a daughter who had been alive that morning and was now not alive, and she was on a mountain, and the mountain offered her no comfort of the ordinary kind. There was no one to sit with. There was no one to share the weight. There were the walls of the hermitage, and the window facing east, and the butter lamp, and the practice. She sat. She did not perform composure. She did not attempt to bring the Dharma's teachings about impermanence to bear on her grief in a way that would allow her to move through it more quickly. She had received those teachings, and she trusted them, and they were not what was required in those first hours. What was required in those first hours was simply the full presence of a mother who had just lost her child. She let herself be that. She wept. Not the careful weeping of someone monitoring themselves for excess, but the complete weeping of a person whose body understands something that the mind is still catching up to. The understanding that the particular configuration of the world that included her daughter was now permanently altered. That the specific weight and smell and sound of her daughter's presence in the world would not be available to her again. She wept until the lamp needed oil. She added oil. She wept some more. At some point in the night, something shifted. Not into peace, not into acceptance, into a quality she could not immediately name. A quality that she would spend years attempting to describe in the conversations she later had with students who came to her with grief of their own. What she found, in the exhaustion after the weeping, was the awareness that had been present throughout. Not the grief, not the pain, the awareness in which the grief and the pain were arising. The awareness that had received the news that morning. The awareness that had been present through every moment of the daughter's life, through every season of the practice on the mountain, through everything that had come before the grief, and was still present inside the grief. That awareness was not broken. It was witnessing the breaking, but it was not broken. She spent 3 more years on the mountain after her daughter died. Not because grief requires retreat, because she had understood in those 3 years that the practice and the grief were not opposites, that the grief was not something the practice needed to overcome, that the practice was not the suppression or the transcendence or the spiritual management of the grief. They were the same movement. The love that produced the grief and the awareness that received the grief were made of the same thing. She came down from the mountain when she was ready. She taught for 30 years in the valley below. Those who knew her in those years said that she was the teacher you went to when you were in pain, not because she had found a way to make the pain smaller, but because she had found a way to be fully inside it without being destroyed by it. And she transmitted this quality in the way that certain teachers transmit things, without words, simply through the quality of presence they bring when they sit with you. When students came to her with grief, she did not offer comfort in the usual sense. She offered company. She sat beside them. She did not look away from what they were carrying. One student asked her once, "How do I survive this?" She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "You already are. Survival is not something you achieve after grief. It is something you are doing in every moment of the grief itself. The breathing you are doing right now is survival. The fact that you came here and asked this question is survival. You are not trying to survive this. You are surviving it. Right now. In this moment. She paused. The grief will not kill you, she said. It will change you. Those are different things. This is the first thing tonight's stories offer. Not comfort in the sense of the diminishment of what you feel. The specific company of a woman who sat on a mountain in the 12th century with news that could not be undone, and found that the awareness in which grief arises is not the grief, and that this distinction, held carefully and without forcing, is the beginning of the way through. You are not being asked to feel less tonight. You are being invited to notice that the one doing the feeling has not been destroyed by what it is feeling. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, the whole thing. Let your shoulders soften now. Let the breath be full on the exhale, complete, not held. The mountain is patient. The lamp is burning. You are here. And as the butter lamp burns through the long night in Sultrim Palmo's hermitage in the eastern Tibetan mountains, and the grief continues its patient work, we travel now eastward and forward 2 centuries, to Japan, where a monk's teacher died before he was ready, and where the unreadiness became the most honest teaching the teacher could have given him. In the mountain province of Echizen in western Japan, in the middle years of the Kamakura period, in the 13th century, there was a Soto Zen monastery called Eiheiji, the Temple of Eternal Dharma, built by the great master Dogen in the mountain cedars above a river valley. A young monk named Gikun had been practicing at Eiheiji for 7 years when his teacher died. The teacher had not been old. He was 51. The illness had been brief, and the brevity of it had given no one time to prepare, which is perhaps what illness intends, since preparation for a death is in some ways a way of avoiding the death until the last possible moment. There had been no final instruction, no gathered students receiving a last transmission. The teacher had been ill for 2 weeks, and then he was not alive, and that was all. Gikun had expected to have more time. He had expected more time in the specific way that serious students expect more time with their teachers, which is to say, without quite expecting it consciously at all, simply through the daily assumption that the teacher would be there tomorrow as the teacher had been there today. The assumption was so embedded that its removal felt not like the expected loss of something that was always going to be lost, but like the removal of something that had no business being removed. He sat in the meditation hall on the morning after the teacher's death, and he could not practice. This was not a crisis of technique. He knew the form. He had been sitting in that hall for 7 years. His body knew how to arrange itself in the posture, how to settle the breath, how to hold the quality of attention that formal practice requires. His body did all of this on its own. But the quality inside the sitting was different. Hollow in a way, the sitting had never been hollow before. The sitting that had always felt, even in the most difficult sessions, like it was doing something, felt that morning like performing the movements of swimming in a room that contained no water. He stayed in the hall after the morning session. The other monks left for their duties. He stayed. He was sitting with the specific grief of a student who has lost a teacher, which is a particular kind of grief and not a lesser one, though the world tends to rank grief by the closeness of the relationship and often fails to understand that what a teacher gives a serious student is something that family and friends and lovers cannot give, something that has to do with the specific quality of attention brought to the development of who the student actually is. The teacher had been the person who saw him most clearly, not most lovingly, most clearly, who was not invested in any particular version of him and therefore could see the versions that did exist with a precision that love, in its investment, cannot always manage. And now that precision was gone from the world. He sat in the empty hall. After a long time, something arrived that he did not expect. Not comfort, something more uncomfortable than comfort and more real. He understood that the teacher had been pointing at something all along that was not the teacher. Every instruction, every correction, every encounter in the Dokusan room, every morning's teaching had been pointing at something in Gikan that had nothing to do with the teacher's continued existence. The teacher had been a finger pointing at the moon, and the teacher's death was a final, unequivocal pointing. The finger was gone. The moon remained. Not as a consolation, as a fact. The moon had always been there. The pointing had been the teaching, and the pointing was not the teaching. The teacher had been trying, for 7 years, to give Gikan something that could not be given, only recognized. And the recognition was Gikan's, not the teacher's, and the teacher's death changed nothing about whether or not the recognition was possible. He would have to continue without the pointing. This was terrifying, and also, once the terror had been felt fully, clarifying. He had been practicing for 7 years in the direction of something. He knew the direction. He would have to walk it himself now. He went to the teacher's room that afternoon and sat beside the body for a long time. He said nothing. The tradition does not record that he said anything. He simply sat, as the teacher had taught him to sit, in the presence of the fact of the matter. The teacher had died. The practice continued. These were not contradictory. In the years that followed, Gikan became a teacher himself. Those who came to practice with him said that he taught with a particular quality of directness that was not characteristic of all teachers, a quality of not allowing students to mistake the pointing for the thing being pointed at. He was strict about this, gently but consistently strict. One student asked him why he was so particular about this one thing. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because someone I loved died before I was ready. And I learned from that dying that I had been practicing with the teacher when I should have been practicing with the practice. I do not want to make the same thing happen to anyone who sits with me." The student asked, "Did you ever stop missing him?" Gikan thought about this for a long time. Then he said, "I stopped expecting him to come back. That is different. The missing is still there. I have simply stopped arguing with it." He paused. "And sometimes," he said, "when the sitting is deep and the morning is very still, I feel the quality of his attention. Not him, the quality. The way certain rooms hold the warmth of a fire long after the fire has been extinguished. That warmth," he said, "does not require his presence to continue." This is the teaching from the empty hall in Aheji. The person you have lost was pointing at something in you. The pointing is complete. What was being pointed at is still there, still yours, still requiring your presence to be recognized. The grief of their absence is real, and it asks to be honored completely. And underneath the grief, also real, is the thing they were pointing you toward the entire time. Let your chest open slightly on the next breath, as though there is more room inside it than the grief has been allowing. There is. The grief is real, and it does not take up all the room. What they gave you takes up the rest. And as the autumn leaves fall on the stone paths of Aheji and Gikan sits with his teacher's absence in the empty hall, we travel westward and forward 1 century to the great capital of Tang Dynasty, China, where a poet-monk wrote 100 poems about loss and understood, in the writing of the last one, what the writing had been doing all along. In the city of Chang'an, during the mature years of the Tang Dynasty, in the late 8th century, there was a monk poet named Zhao Ran, who is remembered in the history of Chinese literature as one of the finest poets of his period, and who is remembered in the history of Chinese Buddhism as a practitioner who made a discovery about the relationship between grief and writing that he did not expect to make, and that changed something in him permanently. He was a monk of the Chan tradition, trained in the direct pointing style of that tradition's mature period. And he was also a poet, and these two things lived in him not in tension, but in a particular kind of productive relationship that the Tang period, with its extraordinary confluence of artistic and spiritual culture, sometimes made possible. He had a friend, not a casual acquaintance, a genuine friend, of the kind that a person who has spent much of their adult life in monasteries occasionally and gratefully finds. Another person whose company makes the world feel slightly more inhabitable than it does alone. A poet named Lu Yu, a layman and a tea scholar, who shared with Jiaoran both an interest in verse and an interest in the deeper questions that verse sometimes opens onto. They had known each other for decades. They met when circumstances permitted, which was not often, and they corresponded when circumstances did not permit, which was more frequent. The correspondence was a form of friendship that suited them both, being people for whom language was not a substitute for presence, but an extension of it. Lu Yu died in his early 70s. Jiaoran was 68 when his friend died, and he had known for some years that the friend was failing in the way that people of their age fail. Gradually, the specific systems of the body beginning to complete their work, the intervals between coherence and difficulty shortening. He had known this and had not been prepared. He wrote a poem. He wrote it the way he always wrote poems, which was not as a performance for an audience, but as an attempt to understand something he could not understand through any other means. The poem was about his friend, about the specific quality of his presence, about a conversation they had had on a particular afternoon that Jiaoran found himself returning to, in the way that the mind returns to things it has not finished with. The poem did not resolve anything. He wrote another one. He wrote poems about loss for 40 years. Not only about this loss, about every loss, about the nature of loss itself, about what the tradition said about loss, and what his own experience said about loss, and the places where those two things confirmed each other, and the places where they diverged. He wrote about the dead, and about the dying, and about the specific particular quality of absences that had once been presences. By the time he was writing the 100th poem, he was very old. His hands were not steady. He wrote slowly. When he set down the brush after the 100th poem, he sat for a long time. He understood something he had not understood when he wrote the first poem, or the 10th, or the 50th. The poems had not been about loss. They had been loss working itself through him. Each poem was not a description of grief, but a movement of grief, a specific passage of what had accumulated in him, finding its way through the particular channel that language opened and moving through and becoming something slightly different on the other side. He had not been writing about impermanence, he had been practicing impermanence. Each poem was a small release, not of the memory of what had been lost, of the holding of the loss in the particular way that holding things prevents them from moving through. Grief, he understood, is not a state. It is a movement. It wants to move. When it is allowed to move, it does not diminish the love that produced it. It transforms into something more like the love itself, which does not require the presence of its object to be real. He had been giving the grief permission to move for 40 years, in the only way he knew how to give it permission, by writing it down, by giving it form, by allowing it to be exactly what it was, in words that asked nothing of it except honesty. The 100th poem was the simplest he had written, 4 lines. A description of the light on a particular hillside in the late afternoon of a day in autumn. No mention of loss, no mention of the friend, simply the light and the hillside, and the quality of the day. His student who was copying the poems asked why the last poem was so different from the others. Jiaoran thought about this for a long time. Then he said, "Because by the time I wrote it, The grief had finished becoming what it was becoming. What was left was the world, still here, still itself. The light still falling on the hillside in the afternoon. He paused. What we love, he said, does not leave us when we lose it. It becomes part of how we see. The 100 poems are still referenced in the history of Tang Dynasty verse, not because they are the most technically accomplished poems Jiaoran wrote, but because of something in them that readers in every subsequent century have recognized. The quality of someone who has been fully inside loss and has not turned away from it and has not been destroyed by it. The quality of grief that has been allowed to do its work. Tonight, whatever you are carrying has the right to move. It does not need to be held in place. It does not need to be managed or kept in proportion or brought under control. It is grief, and grief is love, with nowhere to go, and when it is allowed to move, it finds its way back to love. Let your hands open now, wherever they rest. Let the palms be soft. The 100th poem is always simpler than the first. The light is still falling on the hillside. And as Jiaoran sets down his brush in the lamplight of the Tang Dynasty capital, and the 100 poems lie on the desk around him, we travel northward and forward 3 centuries, to the Goryeo kingdom of Korea, where a laywoman sat beside her husband's deathbed and received in that sitting a teaching that changed her understanding of every teaching she had previously received. In the province of Gyeonggi, in the Goryeo kingdom of Korea, in the late 11th century, there was a woman named Chung-sim, a lay Buddhist practitioner who had maintained a daily practice since her early 20s and who was, at the time of this story, 62 years old. She had been married to the same man for 41 years. He was a silk merchant, a quiet man of considerable competence in his trade and considerable reticence about everything else, the kind of person who demonstrates love not through eloquence, but through a 40-year pattern of small, consistent attentions, which is in the end a more demanding form of love than eloquence, and a more reliable one. He had been ill for 2 years, not dramatically. The illness was the kind that does not announce itself loudly, but moves steadily in a direction that everyone who knows it understands. The physicians had done what they could. The family had arranged what could be arranged. There had been good days and less good days, and Chung-sim had been present through all of them with the specific quality of a woman who has accepted what is happening without having accepted that it is easy. On the last night, she sat beside him. The room was quiet. The children were asleep. The lamp was burning low. Her husband was present in the specific way of someone who is close to the end, profoundly interior, not quite here and not quite elsewhere. She had received many teachings about this moment. She had sat in halls and listened to monks speak about the nature of consciousness at the time of death, about the importance of the dying person's mental state, about what the tradition said was helpful and what was not. She had received all of this, and she believed all of it in the abstract, and in this moment, none of it was what she needed. What she had was her hand on her husband's hand. She sat through the night. She did not try to fill the silence with anything. She was simply present with the specific quality of someone who has finally, after a long illness and a long preparation, stopped trying to make the situation be anything other than what it was. He died in the early hours of the morning. The light was just beginning to come through the paper screen of the window. She felt the moment in the way that people who are present feel it, not as an event that announces itself, but as a quality of change in the room, something that had been present, no longer present, the particular silence that is different from all other silences. She sat with this for a long time. She did not weep immediately. The weeping came later, in waves, over days and weeks and months, in the specific pattern of grief that does not arrive all at once, but comes as the loss registers in different parts of you at different times. First, the obvious losses, then the unexpected ones. The particular way he had moved through a room, the sound of him in the kitchen before the household woke, the specific weight of his presence in the bed she now slept in alone. But on that morning, in the first hour after his death, what she felt was something she had not expected to feel. Gratitude. Not the performed gratitude of someone trying to find the positive thing in a difficult situation. Something more specific. Gratitude for the actual content of the 41 years, for the particular person he had been, for the specific quality of the love, which had not been dramatic or eloquent, but had been so consistent and so present that it had become the air she breathed without knowing it, and now she could smell it in its absence, which was perhaps the clearest she had ever understood what it was. She had received it, all of it. For 41 years she had received it, and it was in her, not as a memory only, as a quality of what she had become, in the long, slow way that people become what they have been consistently loved as. She was, in some specific and not metaphorical way, partly made of what he had given her. He was not here to give it anymore. What he had given was already given. It was already hers. She went to the monastery in the valley 2 weeks after the burial. She sat with the senior monk who had been her teacher for many years. She told him what had happened on that last morning. Not the death, the gratitude. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "You received the teaching that night, that all the teachings were pointing toward." She asked, "Which teaching?" He said, "That love does not end when the person ends." The person was the container. The love was what the container held. The container is gone. What it held is yours. She practiced for 20 more years after her husband's death. Those who knew her in those years said she seemed, not lighter exactly, not unaffected by the loss, but more solidly herself than she had been before. As though the grief, fully felt, had pressed something into her that the comfort of his presence had been gently holding in place without her knowing it. She became herself more completely in the grief. This is what grief does when it is not fought or managed or moved through too quickly. It presses what we have loved most deeply into us. It makes permanent what presence made temporary. The person you are grieving made you something. Every day of the relationship, something was given and received. That is in you now. It will not be taken when the grief eases. It will remain. Let your hands be still now, both of them, warm wherever they rest. The 41 years are not lost. They are in you. They will be in you on the morning when you no longer weep, and on the morning after that. And as the morning light comes through the paper screen in Chung Sim's room in the Goryeo Kingdom, and the grief begins its long, patient work, we travel southward to the forests of Burma, where a monk spent 3 years practicing in a cemetery and found in those 3 years not despair, but a quality of attention to living that changed everything. In the Sagaing Hills region of central Burma, in the late 18th century, there was a forest monastery whose tradition of practice included, among its more unusual aspects, a period of retreat in the cremation ground on the hill above the monastery for monks who had reached a certain stage in their practice and whose teacher believed they were ready for what such a retreat offered. A monk named Sayadaw U Panyavaro entered this retreat in his 35th year, following 12 years of monastic practice that his teacher described as thorough, disciplined, and not yet fully honest. The description puzzled him. He had been thorough, he had been disciplined, he had kept the precepts without lapse, and had maintained the practice schedule with a consistency that had earned him the respect of the senior monks in the community. He did not immediately understand what his teacher meant by not yet fully honest. He understood it in the cremation ground. He had been there for 3 months when he understood it. The understanding came not dramatically, but in the accumulation of 3 months of sitting in the place where the bodies of the community's dead were brought, and where the fires had been burning for generations, and where, if you sat long enough and attended carefully enough, you could come to know in a way that intellectual understanding could not provide what the body actually is and what it is not. He had been practicing a teaching that the Buddha gave in the Satipatthana Sutta, the contemplation of the body as it undergoes its dissolution, for the specific purpose of understanding what impermanence means not as a concept, but as a direct recognition. For 12 years he had understood impermanence as a concept. In the cremation ground, he understood it as a fact. And in understanding it as a fact, he understood what his teacher had meant by not yet fully honest. He had been practicing as though he had more time than he had, not consciously, not through any negligence, simply through the assumption that is built into the very structure of ordinary consciousness, that the present moment is the situation, and the future is where things will eventually be resolved, that there is time to become more present, to practice more deeply, to love more fully, to say the things that need to be said. There is time, but not in the way ordinary consciousness assumes. There is this moment, and then there is this moment, and the body of the person sitting in the cremation ground is doing, at a pace too slow to observe directly, but not too slow to understand, the same thing that all the bodies he had watched brought to the hill were doing. He was not afraid. This surprised him. He had expected fear and had prepared for it, and it had not arrived. What arrived instead was something he struggled to name for years afterward, and eventually settled on describing as clarity of use. He understood what he was for. He understood that the years and the practice and the precepts were not a preparation for something that would arrive later. They were the thing. Now, in this moment and the next, in every conversation and every bowl of rice and every sitting and every walking, all of it, all of the time, was the thing itself. He came down from the cremation ground after 3 years lighter than he had gone up, not because he had resolved the question of death, because he had stopped treating it as a question. He was one of the warmest teachers anyone had ever encountered. Those who practiced with him in his later years said he had a quality of presence that made people feel that the moment they were in was the most important moment, and also entirely sufficient, both of these things at once. One student asked him what had given him this quality. He said, 3 years of sitting with the bodies of the dead. Not because the dead taught me to be afraid of dying, because they taught me to stop waiting. He paused. When you know clearly that time is what it is, he said, you stop saving your attention for later. You stop performing presence and start being present. The living deserve the same attention we give to the dying. The dying deserve the same attention we give to the living. There is no difference. What the Burmese monks' years in the cremation ground offer tonight is not instruction in how to think about death. It is something simpler. The person you have lost was here, fully, entirely, completely here, the way all people are here without our always noticing. And then they were not. The grief is the noticing. The grief is the sudden clarity about what was here when it was here. And this clarity, painful as it is also one of the most valuable things a human being can receive. Let the breath be full now, complete. You are here, entirely here. The grief is the proof of it. And as the forest birds begin their morning sequences in the Sagaing Hills, and Upanyavaro descends the hill from the cremation ground after his last night of retreat, we come now to the last 2 stories of this night, both of them women, both of them very old, both of them having carried grief for longer than most people carry anything, and both of them having found in the long carrying something they could not have found any other way. In the Red River Delta region of northern Vietnam, In the late years of the Lay Dynasty, in the 17th century, there was a village in the province of Nam Dinh where everyone knew the grandmother who sat in the doorway of her house in the evenings and watched the road. Her name was Ba Tam, which is simply what people called her, a respectful address for an elder woman, not a personal name, which is a kind of anonymity that certain people accumulate over the course of a very long life lived in one place, becoming so continuous a part of the landscape that the landscape names them for itself. She was 81 years old. She had lived in that house for 60 of those years, since she had come there as a young bride. She had raised 7 children in it. She had buried 4 of them. Not in the order that nature intends, which was part of what made the burying what it was. 2 had died as children to the fever that moved through the delta every few years. 1 had died in his 20s in a conflict that was not his conflict but became his anyway, in the way that conflicts do when they arrive in the countryside and do not inquire about the preferences of the people whose countryside it is. 1 had died in her 40s, of an illness that moved slowly and without mercy, in a way that gave Ba Tam time to sit beside her, and was in some ways better for that, and in other ways harder. The 3 who had survived were grown and gone to the city, or to the next province, or to the lives that growing children go to, and they came back at the festivals, and sometimes not even then, and she did not reproach them for this, because she understood that life moves in the direction life moves, and this is not a moral failing. She sat in her doorway. People came to her when they were grieving, not because she offered advice, which she did not, or because she offered consolation, which she could not, or because she had found some way to make grief easier, which she had not. They came because of the quality of her presence, which was the quality that people who have been near fire for a long time carry. A kind of warmth that comes from having been in the same place as heat, not the heat itself, but its lasting quality in the stone. A young woman from the village came to her after the death of her first child, an infant loss, the kind that leaves no language, because there is no language that was ever developed for it. She sat beside Ba Tam in the doorway, without speaking. After a long time, Ba Tam spoke. She said, "I have sat here in this doorway for 60 years and watched many things pass on that road, the rains of many seasons, children growing up and walking away. I have watched the road take 4 of my own children, and not one of them has it brought back." The young woman was weeping. Ba Tam said, "I want to tell you what I have understood from this, if you would like to hear it." The young woman nodded. Ba Tam said, "The road takes things and the road does not bring them back. This is the nature of the road. I spent many years being angry about the nature of the road. I spent many years believing that the road owed me something for what it had taken." She was quiet for a moment. "The road does not owe me anything. It is simply what it is. It goes in one direction and things pass along it, and some of those things are the people I love most, and after they have passed, I cannot call them back." She looked at the young woman. "But they passed in front of this doorway. I saw them. They were here. Every one of them was here in this house, in this room, eating at this table, sleeping in these beds, filling up this space with all the particular noise and weight and warmth of themselves. The road did not take that. The road only took the continuation of it." She paused. "What they were in this house is in this house still, not as ghosts, as what they made. The shape of this place, the way I cook, the specific words I use that I learned from the daughter who is gone, the particular way I hold a child that I learned from my mother who is gone. All of this is in me and in this house, and it goes nowhere." She looked at the road. "I am not calm because I have made peace with loss," she said. "I am calm because I have finally understood what the loss did not take." The young woman stayed in the doorway until the light was almost gone. Then she went home. She came back the following week, and the week after that. She came back for years, until Ba Tam was no longer in the doorway, and then she sat in the doorway herself, in the way that certain people receive something and pass it on without always knowing they are doing it. The road takes things, and the road does not bring them back. And what the road takes is not the same as what the person gave you. What they gave you, the specific weight and warmth of their having been exactly who they were in your specific life, this is yours. It was yours before they were gone. It is yours still. Let this settle now, not as a consolation that replaces the grief, but as a truth that can live alongside it. Both are real. The gone is gone. The given is yours. Let your eyes be heavy now. Let the doorway be here, warm in the last of the evening light. The road goes on. You are still here. And as Ba Tam's evening light fades and the road grows dark and the village settles into its night sounds, we come to the last story of this evening, to Sri Lanka, and to a very old nun who was asked on the last morning of her life whether she was afraid, and whose answer has been carried through the tradition for 1,500 years. In the ancient city of Anuradhapura in Sri Lanka, in the 5th or 6th century of the Common Era, there was a nun named Ambapali Teri. Not the Ambapali of the earlier stories, but a different woman who had taken the same name in the tradition, as was sometimes done, as a form of aspiration. She was very old when this story finds her. The exact year of her birth was not recorded, as the years of birth of women rarely were in that period and place. But those who knew her in her final years estimated her to be somewhere past 80, possibly considerably past. She had been a nun since her late 20s. She had practiced through the long middle years of her monastic life with the consistency and the depth that only become possible in a life organized entirely around the practice, with no competing claims on the attention. She had outlived most of the people she had come to the monastery with. She had outlived the abbess who had ordained her and 2 of the 3 teachers under whom she had practiced. She had outlived many students. On the last morning of her life, she was sitting in the monastery garden in the early light, which was her habit when the weather permitted and her body allowed. A small figure, wrapped in the ochre robe that had long since faded to a color closer to the light amber of old honey. A young novice who had been in the monastery for only a few months came to sit beside her, as she sometimes did. The novice was 17. She had come to the monastery from a family that had lost much, and the rawness of that loss was still present in her, in the specific way of someone who has not yet had time to understand what has happened to them. She sat beside the old nun. After a while she asked, very quietly, "Are you afraid?" The old nun looked at her. She understood what was being asked. The novice had been watching her fail for weeks and knew, in the way that people who have sat beside loss know, what was happening. The old nun was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "No." The novice waited. The old nun said, "I was afraid once. For many years I was afraid. Not only of death, afraid of loss, afraid of the people I loved being taken, afraid of the pain of caring for things that would not last, afraid of the grief that waited at the end of every love." She paused. She said, "I practiced for a long time with that fear, not to get rid of it, to understand it. And what I understood eventually was this. The fear was protecting something I did not need to protect." She looked at the garden around her, the old trees, the morning light on the stone path, the birds just beginning. "Everything I ever loved is still here," she said. "Not in the way it was. The people I loved are not here in the way they were here. But the loving is here. The loving never went anywhere." She put her hand briefly on the novice's hand. "The loving is what I am," she said. "It is what was here before the people I loved, and it was what remained after they were gone, and it will be what remains after this body is gone. The body was not the loving was what the body was carrying." She looked at the young girl. "You will lose more things than you have lost," she said. "This is certain, but you will also love more things than you have loved, and the loving is always larger than the losing, always, even when it does not feel that way." She died that afternoon. The novice sat beside her. She told what had been said to others in the years that followed, and others told it further, and it traveled the way certain things travel in the tradition, not because anyone decided to preserve it, but because it is the kind of thing that people who need it recognize when they hear it and carry forward. The loving is what you are. It was here before the people who carried it, and it will be here after. The grief is the loving with nowhere to go. And the loving with nowhere to go is not lesser loving. It is simply loving that has not yet found its next form. It will find it. Let the breath be slow and complete now. Let the body be heavy and held. Let the old nun's morning light be in this room, thin and gold, and asking nothing of you except your presence inside it. We have traveled far tonight, from the Tibetan mountains where a woman grieved inside the practice and found the practice had room for all of it, to the empty hall in Japan where a monk sat with the absence of his teacher and understood what the teacher had been pointing at, to the lamplight in Tang Dynasty, China, where a poet wrote 100 poems and found in the last one the light still falling on the hillside, to the Korean room where a woman sat beside her husband through the last night and received in the sitting 41 years of gratitude, to the Burmese cemetery where a monk learned to stop waiting, to the Vietnamese doorway where an old woman sat for 60 years and understood what the road had not taken, and to the Sri Lankan garden where a very old nun told a frightened girl that the loving is what we are. 7 traditions, 10 centuries, 7 different forms of the same recognition. That grief is not the evidence that you loved wrongly, or too much, or in the wrong direction. That grief is love's most honest form. That the loving does not end when the person ends. That what they gave you is yours. Let the names dissolve now. Sultrim Palmo, Gikan, Jaoran, Chungsim, Upanyavaro, Batam, Ambapali Theri. Let the stories return to the silence they came from. What remains is what was always here. The breath, still moving. The body, still here. The loving, which is what you are, which was not taken with the one you lost, which is present in this moment as fully as it was present in every moment before the loss. You are not less for having loved and lost. You are exactly who the loving made you. If sleep is reaching for you now, let it come. The stories will find you wherever you are. The grief will do its work in the dark, as grief has always done, slowly and completely, without requiring your supervision. Let go, not of the love, of the holding of the loss so tightly that the love cannot breathe inside it. The love is still here. Good night. I want to say something before you go. I made this channel for nights like this one, for the hours when the grief is quiet enough to sit with, but too present to sleep through. The teachers in tonight's stories knew this darkness. They sat with it. They did not look away. And what they found in the not looking away is what I have tried to bring to you tonight. If these stories gave you one moment of company in the dark, I am genuinely glad. Leave one word in the comments if you feel like it. Just one word for what you are carrying. Someone will read it and feel less alone for having seen it. And if the quiet Dharma is somewhere you want to return, the subscribe button is there. It costs nothing. It just means the next time a night like this one comes, this will be waiting. Sleep well. The loving is still here. Good night.